Today on Introductory Politics, we are discussing the final few amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Amendments 16 through 27, most of which are quite simple and easy to understand. Again, some have very far reaching and significant impacts, but ultimately are still quite simple. The 16th Amendment, for example, gives Congress an additional power, and this is the power to tax everyone's individual income. The income taxes that we pay, say, for example, automatically out of our paychecks, and the fact that we have to file our federal income tax return forms every year, all of that is based off of the 16th Amendment, which gives Congress this ability to directly tax individuals based on their income. The 17th Amendment. The 17th Amendment deals with the selection process for U.S. senators. When it comes to the selection process for members of Congress, Article 1 makes it quite clear that members of the House of Representatives were to be elected by the people. We call that popular election. But when it comes to U.S. senators, U.S. senators were not to be chosen directly by the people. They were actually chosen by state legislatures. And so state governments would ultimately choose who they wanted to be representatives in the U.S. Senate. The 17th Amendment is going to change that. The 17th Amendment is going to change that selection process to where as members of the public, directly elect not just members of the House of Representatives, but also directly elect U.S. senators as well. The 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment is a unique public policy amendment where we get the prohibition of alcohol. The 18th Amendment was adopted in 1919, which banned the manufacture, distribution, and consumption, possession and consumption of alcohol, and lasts for a little while, for about 14 years. And so, this 18th Amendment, where alcohol was seen as essentially kind of the root of all evil, is why prohibition of alcohol was adopted. The 20th Amendment, or sorry, 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment grants women the right to vote. It bans any sort of ability to kind of stop women from voting by not by saying essentially the same kind of language as the 15th Amendment does, where it says that you cannot abridge the right to vote on the basis of race. The 19th Amendment says you cannot abridge the right to vote on the basis of sex. This constitutional amendment was adopted in 1920. Women have had the right to vote in the United States for just over 100 years. The 20th Amendment. The 20th Amendment deals with presidential terms and succession. The 20th Amendment is more of an administrative amendment. All it really does is it changes the date for when Congress starts their legislative session and when the presidential term of office begins and ends. So, for example, the 20th Amendment says the terms of the president and the vice president shall end at noon on the 20th day of January, and the terms of senators and representatives at noon on the third day of January of the years in which such terms would have ended, blah, 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 blah. And so ultimately, it's changing some dates and times as to when we actually transition power from, say, one president to the next, or from some members of Congress to the next set of members of Congress. The 21st Amendment. The 21st Amendment is a unique amendment in that it is the only amendment that gets rid of a different amendment. Earlier, just a second ago, mentioned the 18th Amendment and the prohibition of alcohol in 1919. The 21st Amendment was the repeal of the 18th Amendment in 1933. It gets rid of the Prohibition Amendment. The 22nd Amendment. The 22nd Amendment, again, quite simple. The 22nd Amendment establishes presidential term limits and says that presidential term limits are limited, that the president is limited to two terms, two elected terms of office. In particular, just to clarify, because this is one that has kind of been in the news from time to time regarding the possibility of a third presidential term, just to clarify, the 22nd Amendment reads this way. no person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice, and no person who has held the office of president or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected president shall be elected to the office of the president more than once. But this article shall not apply to any person holding the office of president when this article was proposed by the Congress, et cetera, et cetera. And so this 21st or sorry 22nd Amendment is making a very specific reference to elected office, not necessarily inherited office. And so when it comes to, say, for example, whether or not a president can achieve a third term through some other means via that is different from an election, remains a little bit of an open question. Historically, the belief is that it is, not that it is always just meant a maximum of 2 terms. The language doesn't quite read that way. And so when it comes to that, there is, again, even though the language is a bit kind of clear in a sense, it still leaves some room for ambiguity when it comes to the actual implementation of that amendment. The 23rd Amendment. The 23rd Amendment is discussing the Electoral College and Washington, D.C. If you recall in the discussion of the Electoral College in Article 2 says that states will choose electors to essentially participate in the Electoral College. However, Washington, D.C. is not a state, but there are American citizens who live in Washington, D.C., which essentially means that if you lived in Washington, D.C., you were essentially not able to vote for president. You still could vote, say, for example, for president, but there was no representation in the Electoral College for the actual presidential vote. And so, what the 23rd Amendment does is it gives Washington, D.C. 3 electors in the Electoral College, which is the minimum that any state could potentially receive. The 24th Amendment. The 24th Amendment essentially provides a ban on the poll tax. The poll tax was used in some states as a qualification for voting in federal elections, but essentially after the Civil War, this was used for the most part in southern states for federal elections, but the 24th Amendment bans it. The 25th Amendment. The 25th Amendment deals with presidential succession and ultimately has 4 different sections of this amendment dealing with what happens when the president is essentially unable to serve as president of the United States. And so when it comes to these 4 articles, one of them has to do with just kind of what happens when there is a presidential vacancy, who becomes president after that, et cetera, that sort of stuff. One other section of the 25th Amendment deals with a vacancy in the office of the vice president, which essentially says that if there is a vacancy in the office of vice president, then the president gets to appoint a new vice president. The Senate does have to confirm that person, but the president gets to choose who the new vice president is going to be. The third section of the 25th Amendment essentially allows the president to temporarily give up some of their power, or to temporarily give up their power as president, for certain reasons. So, for example, Section 3 says, whenever the president transmits to the president pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives his written declaration that he is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, and until he transmits them a written declaration to the contrary, such powers and duties shall be discharged by the vice president as acting president. The way that this works, the way that what Section 3 is essentially trying to articulate is that sometimes the president may know that they are unable to discharge the office of the presidency. So, take for example, let's say Donald Trump has to undergo some sort of surgery where he needs to go under general anesthesia, right? And so, in that case, he is not literally not able to act as president. And so, Section 3 gives Donald Trump the ability to hand over the presidency to JD Vance temporarily until essentially like he recovers from surgery and anesthesia, and then he can have his presidency back. right? That's what Section 3 is trying to provide. Section 4 provides for a really interesting series of text when it comes to presidential capacity. I'll read it first and then explain what it says. Section 4 says whenever the vice president and a majority of either the principal officers of the executive departments or of such other body as Congress may by law provide transmit to the president pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives their written declaration that the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. The vice president shall immediately assume the powers and duties of the office as acting president. What Section 4 is essentially arguing is that the vice president has the ability to essentially take away the presidency from the president. The vice president cannot do this on their own. They need more than half of the essentially the leaders of the cabinet departments. So would need, say, the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, there are 15 different cabinet level departments, would need at least 8 of those plus their own signature delivered to the House and Senate leadership, and then the vice president automatically becomes president at that point in time. Section 4 then does go on to say, though, however, thereafter, when the president transmits to the president pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House his written declaration that no inability exists, he shall resume the powers and duties of his office unless the vice president and a majority of either the principal officers of the executive departments or of such other body as Congress may by law provide transmit within 4 days to the president pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives their written declaration that the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. There's a lot of text there, but basically says if the vice president is trying to use the 25th Amendment to take the presidency for themselves, the president is likely to say, "No, I'm fine. You don't get to take the presidency away from me." The vice president has 4 days to basically say, "Here is why we think that the president is not able to stay as president." If that happens, then Congress has to essentially decide whether or not the presidency stays with the president or if it gets transferred to the vice president. In order to do that, there needs to be a two-thirds majority vote of both chambers to essentially take away the presidency from the president of the United States. So it's this really interesting language here in the 25th Amendment that essentially provides for a different way of getting rid of the president of the United States, um, as a process different than impeachment. The 26th Amendment, our third and final amendment that deals with voting. The 26th Amendment is very simple. Again, it's similar to the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment dealing with voting rights voting rights on the basis of race and voting rights on the basis of sex. Ultimately, what the 26th Amendment says is that if you are at least 18 years old, you get the right to vote. Prior to this, the right to vote, the age requirement was listed as 21, and the 26th Amendment lowers that to 18. The 27th Amendment, our final constitutional amendment, says that when members of Congress change how much they get paid, one of the things that is in the text is that members of Congress have the ability to essentially determine their own salary. If they do vote to change their salary, though, then that new salary will not take effect until after there has been an election. And so, take for example, if Congress today were to raise their salary from what it currently is, $174,000, to something else, let's say $180,000, then the new salary of $180,000 would not take effect until after this November's election for members of Congress, and it would take effect starting in January of 2027. That's it. Those are the 27 constitutional amendments, a generally brief overview of what they are, in some cases, how they work, who it applies to, etc.